Thanks for coming. I'm really excited about presenting this talk because I'm really lucky in that I get to talk about the thing that I kind of love the most in the world. So this is designing complex SVG animations. My name is Svg Drasner. I'm a senior UX engineer at Trulia, and I take my job really seriously. This is me taking my job seriously as a child, and I just really enjoy the marriage of interaction with the way that we can talk about animation for SVG and other types of animation. And I'm going to kind of go into like a few different ways of working with complex animations. So first up is why. Like, why would we spend time learning SVG, complex SVG animations? Like, what practical use cases do we have, and what like kind of illustrative use cases do we have? Well, one thing is that animation is really powerful to convey meaning. So if you think about a website where you're calling attention by showing somebody like a red button or something like that, there's nothing that calls your attention or draws your attention more than something in motion. Animation can help guide your users. I'm going to show you a couple of like little things about what I mean by that and context shifting for the user and how we can kind of aid that process with animation. And also because otherwise we're not using the web to its full potential. The web is like this very powerful, beautiful, bright box where if we're just continually using static layouts, we're not really using it to its full benefit. If we only show engagement through things like modals, through things like modals, we're not actually giving the full attention to animation as it can be deserved. And also because it's really fun. So if we're going to talk about animation as information first before we get into some of the more like fun, complex things we can do with it, animation must be designed. I wrote an article about this in Smashing Magazine that kind of goes into further detail. But like, I don't think that animation is something that you can just slap on top of an application. I think that really you have to think about and consider it just like any other UI, UX component. You don't put anything else on your website that you're not seriously considering the design of. And so animation is no different. It also helps with context shifting, and I'm going to explain what I mean by that like in precise detail in a second. Valhead has a really awesome series called Invisible Animation, or All the Right Moves, which is a Vimeo series where she kind of talks about invisible animation and animation that doesn't disturb the viewer as you're going through it. It also complies with branding. So if you have a continual way that you're dealing with your eases and your structures of eases and those kind of engagements, then it gives a more full experience. Val kind of touched on that in her talk this morning. So, and what I really mean by complies with branding is if you think about something like Google Material Design and like how important and vital that was, when you see Google Material Design, because of the way that they've really considered all of those things and all of those engagements, now when you see Google Material Design on someone else's site, you think Google, which is great, but you're on another person's website. But that's actually really good branding, that if you're on someone else's website entirely, you see a type of motion, and you actually are thinking about Google, that's something that you can consider to be part of your process, your branding, and something that you can be. The other part is that you can be consistent on mobile or fall back to a light version. So sometimes mobile is decoupled. Like let's say you have an app and also a website, and you need those are two completely different languages. You can actually keep those easings and that experience consistent. Some people have an MWeb version, the same kind of thing. If you're designing for responsive, same kind of thing. But the most important premise is probably not to overdo it. I'm going to show you some standalone animations where we're going to do like crazy complex things. And then I'm also going to say that when you're designing your UIs and your UX, not overdoing it is actually probably the most important thing. Because it's so commanding, because animation is so powerful, it's really important to not just throw things all over the page and make people sick and make people kind of frustrated with your UI. So I'm going to separate those two concerns out, and I'm going to talk about UI, UX animation and its complexity separately from a complex standalone animation, which would be something that's like a self-contained unit. So UI, UX animation is basically like things in the UI and UX move together in UX choreography. Val kind of talked about that earlier, and in these slides I have a link to an article about that. Responsive is actually very easily done with SVG, and I'll get into that a little bit more in a minute, but it can be achieved with good media queries, which you already know. So all of these things are like tools that you already have available to you that you might not have thought applied to an animation process. So this was actually made with Sarah Soidan's Circulus tool. It's a really, really cool tool to make a menu component out of SVG that you should check out. So when I talk about context shifting, what do I mean? I was writing a CSS Tricks article about this because I was considering, like, have you ever been at work and you're constantly brought onto a new task just as you ramp up to the last one? You like start to get into it and then someone's like, oh, can you please do this? And then you move off to another task and then you move off to another task. And it starts to feel very frustrating. It feels very like counterproductive, and it's kind of irritating. And your UX works the same way for your users. If you're working through a UX and you're going through a login flow or something, and that is a constant like new modal, or some other kind of engagement where it just pops in front of your face, you're actually interrupting the flow of what they're seeing. So what I mean by that is this like little demo I made here. So rather than like the contact being just turning into another modal, I have it actually becoming the next thing, so we're retaining context there. The placeholder shifts to get out of the way, and if I hit the submit button, this loader comes up and is part of those two elements. And then we finally have this like success screen that allows us to see all of those things, and when I click it, it goes right back into its original form. So through that whole process, we've got like many different layouts, many different types of ideas that we're showing the viewer. They're deciding a few different paths to take, but we're always retaining their context through that UI and UX. Another example is like a form itself. Like your contact form on a website is one of the most powerful tools you have. If you're not thinking about the engagement on your contact form, you're doing your users a disservice, because that's actually how you're finding out any information about who's on your website. So what are some things that I don't like about contact forms? Well, if you ever hit a submit button on a contact form and you are just waiting and you don't know if anything happened, you know, maybe they're like going and updating through the database, but you don't know that as a viewer. You're just constantly sitting there and maybe clicking the same button again and again. You might feel frustrated, especially if you give them your credit card or something, like it's your airline. You're like, you have to book this. You're not sure what happened. So the first thing you need to do, you know, we have our phone or your name and email. The first thing I want to do is let them know that actually touching the button is doing something at all, right? And then when I actually hit it, it becomes the submit loader. And the submit loader kind of keeps their engagement through that process. It actually makes it feel like less time happened than if I had just shown one screen and then another. And then the other thing is that I show them a big, bright success so they know it went through well. And then I'm also giving them another place to go on the site. I'm not just dropping them in like tough. Another thing that I kind of consider with context shifting is a thing called saccade, and I'm probably saying that right. I only read it, so you know when you only read a word, you don't really know how to pronounce it. So that's basically like how we make mental maps of whatever situation we're in. So as a user, we're like looking through and scanning our environment to constantly make a mental map of that situation. So if I isolate the element that I'm kind of trying to bring the user to, they're trying to go to one thing and read one thing in particular, it actually makes it a lot easier for them to grok than just all of that information at once. Standalone. So standalone in SVG animation is like a chance for things to kind of go a little bit more, you know, you can do more complex things. You can kind of show a lot of complex materials and different ways of working. But one thing that's really cool about SVG when you work with SVG animation, well, a few things, is that it's really capable for responsive, and that also if you design properly, it can be a really small file size. And I'll show you what I mean by that in a second as well. This is a little bit of tough love. If the animation feels like sugar on top of your engagement or your environment, it's because you treated it that way. The animation can't just be slapped on at the end of the design process. It actually has to be baked right into it, and it has to be considered as part of the user flow. If it's something that you are just throwing on top, and then it kind of has the potential to be jarring for your users. But if it's something that helps them get through that process or engages them, that's good animation. It's also not one size fits all. A lot of people kind of want to say, like, everybody do this for the web. Everybody don't do this for the web. I think the web is actually kind of too big now for us to make those absolutist calls. Maybe something for, like, you know, a performance metric or something, you can say something like that. But if you're talking about something like animation, what works for my website isn't going to work for your website. If you are something like Fidelity, like an insurance company or something like that, you're going to have like more linear eases. You're going to need everything to kind of seem responsible. But if you have branding like MailChimp, where it's like friendly and bouncy and you have this, you know, monkey and stuff, then you're kind of able to do more playful things with animation, and it actually works with your branding. So yeah, it really means adhering to your branding and solving the problem for your users. And what I'm really, like the really main part of that is saying solving the problem for your users. You're actually problem solving to keep them engaged. You're not just kind of like showing off what you can do. So questions to ask when you're making all of these things. Is it responsive? Does it need to be? If you're making a WebGL experience, it's probably not going to be responsive in the same way that an SVG is. An SVG is going to kind of collapse onto mobile in a different way. Maybe you make a different kind of experience for other types of animation. Do you have a toggle? Val actually wrote a really good article for a list apart about accessibility of animations, because sometimes people have motion design or motion sickness problems. So if you have a toggle, you kind of allow the users to engage with it or not engage with it as they see fit. And that really works for those kind of standalone where a lot of things are moving at once. It's kind of a responsible thing to do. Another question to ask is about your easing structures. Your easing structures are pretty much like a very solid base for the branding of your site, and I'll get into that in a minute. And user flow is what we were just discussing. We also want to ask ourselves, what happens every time? A lot of people talk about component libraries, about, you know, atomic principles and things like that, and how you can actually repeat that occurrence. So what I just showed with that context shifting animation might seem kind of like it's hard to do again and again, but probably on your site you're going to have a couple of different ways, like does it always slide down every single time you click the next engagement? Like thinking about those ways that you can reuse things, thinking about those ways that you can reuse your easing structures, thinking about ways that you can kind of make the experience more holistic for your viewers. So easing is really important because it actually speaks a lot to what the thing is. On one side, we have a ball that feels more like solid. It feels like it's just a solid piece. And then on the other side, we have something that looks like it's more fluid and it has a different kind of gravity. All of that stuff is just done with easing. So just as you consider accents and palette when you're designing something, you can also consider accents and eases. So if you have a fully green palette and you have your really strong CTAs being orange so that it draws attention, you can do the same thing with your animation. For that context shifting one, the only bounce ease I had in the entire thing was that success. It was like basically the only thing that kind of calls your attention in that strong bouncing way. So, you know, I'm kind of considering the things that are immovable and not movable about your project. When I say, like, animation has to be designed, what do I mean? Design and branding. So I doubt that most of you are going to start from scratch with the branding of your product. You're usually handed some branding, right? You also have a kind of immovable performance budget, probably. I would hope that you're, like, checking all of those things and you know what your performance budget allows. So those are your two immovable things. Then, when you make the page structure and your animation and interaction, those things kind of come together and right after the idea for the page. So motion design languages for projects, I know that that seems like a lot of work. Every kind of tooling, every kind of thing that you do, people are telling you to do more work, more work, more work. But It's actually kind of like your tooling in that it's a loss leader. So the first time you set up grunt or gulp, it probably took you a little while to do, and it was kind of hard, and then it just made your process so much faster from then on. So it's just like that. You do it once, or you like kind of consider it every once in a while, but once you set up a system, it's a lot easier. You can also reuse resources like easing functions, mix-ins, extends, variables, all of those things across a whole website, which is really important if you're working on a team. And if mobile is decoupled, yeah, you get to keep them like the same across different platforms. I don't know Java, but I can go talk to an iOS developer and say like, hey, this is what I'm making for the web experience. Can you make something like that on mobile? And it's very easy for us to speak the same language and have a shared experience. And good animation branding guidelines means less communication down the line. If you hire somebody new into your group, then all of a sudden you don't have to like go back through and explain everything. You have it all well documented, and you can show them what your process is, and they can even just start building. So one of the main principles that I'm going to talk about today in kind of designing these complex things is that you design everything first and then slowly show things. So I work for CSS Tricks, and Chris asked me to make this kind of like Easter egg on the site. So when you hit this toggle, it kind of morphs and shifts and turns into tricks. That was actually Chris's idea, the tricks with the Z. So then you click the toggle again, it goes back. So I kind of took the opportunity in making this morphing Easter egg thing to do some nerdy things like CSS Tricks, the star is the logo, so the K becomes the star, and then to complement that, it turns into Saturn, and it's also the bracket, and the S turns into code blocks, and the T is a forking, and the S is a link. So, all kind of like nerdy concepts. But the way that I made it and the way that I designed it was to actually put all of those things on the page at once and then slowly figure out the transitions between those events. It's also really important to storyboard. Don't pay attention to the like little bee guy, that's just me doodling. But if you kind of look, I'm like playing around with a bunch of different concepts. It took me like a bunch of these little drawings to kind of decide where to go. And they're awful, right? They're just really bad drawings. But it doesn't matter because it's not really for anybody else. It's just for me to kind of see where I'm going to go before I get there. Using ugly storyboards will save you time. So if you look at like other people's storyboards and they're these beautiful comics, you might be kind of intimidated. I'm kind of intimidated. I draw all the time. So you might just want to throw out the idea of making one entirely. That's a lot of work. But because storyboards are so important to like really thinking out that entire process, I would say you don't have to make all of those really cool comics or anything. You can just jot down little thumbnails to yourself and they can look horrible, but as long as they kind of give you some information. This took me 15 seconds and I had a way better idea of what I was going to do when I got rolling with that animation. So now we get to the like, why SVG? A lot of people have been talking about why SVG. SVG is really important these days. I'm just going to cover that really briefly. It's crisp on any display. If you have to do image replacement for Retina, you don't have to anymore. There's less HTTP requests to handle. This will become less important with HTTP 2. But we're not there yet for support. So in the meantime, we have to kind of think about that. It's really super easily scalable for responsive. It's in the name, right? It's a very small file size if you design for performance, and I'll go into that in a minute too. It's super easy to animate. You just go into the DOM and grab the element, and you're ready to go. It's also really easy to make accessible. What Sarah was saying earlier about making infographics and things like that, this is a huge boon for us. Infographics used to just be an image. Now we can actually make them accessible to everybody. We can make them easily shareable. We can make them responsive. And it's fun. There's a pattern here. So, she also showed this slide. Look at all of that green. It's really well supported. I think this is the thing that when I'm talking to other developers, that they don't understand about SVG, that we already have really good support for it. They always tell me like, oh, I would use SVG, but it's not well supported. And that's just not true anymore. So I made this pen, and it's kind of like a standalone animation, and it's just a way to show that you can make like a narrative piece with an animation. So it's just a really simple little thing, and it's like, you know, a few second long animation, but you can actually make a full scene with SVG, which is really nice. But before we get started, we're going to optimize. That's a really, really important part of it. Sarah touched on this in her speech too. I use SVG OMG. It's web-based. It's really great because you have a GUI, and you really do need a GUI. When you're optimizing SVG, you have to see what the output is, because sometimes when you just kind of blindly do it, it comes out in ways that are unexpected. I would also say that it's not a, like, just throw it in there and export kind of thing. You should be paying attention to every single one of those toggles, because a lot of them do really important things. There are certain pens where I'm like merging a bunch of paths together, and that's totally fine. There's other ones where I need them to not be merged so that I can grab them and animate each one separately. Also, if you're setting up your design and you're designing in Illustrator and you're like naming each layer or each path very well, as you should be, so you can find it in the DOM later, you don't want to like remove all of the IDs or collapse useless groups, the groups that are just giving you your name. So you should be paying attention to those optimization settings and trying it a couple times and seeing what each one does. I also like Peter Collinridge's SVG editor. It's super old school. The nice thing about it is it actually has an editor too, so you can kind of click the edit panel and play with it as well. SVGO and SVGO GUI are terminal-based. They're what SVG OMG is made out of, but if you want to run it a terminal-based thing and also have a GUI, there's GitHub repos for that. And also, before we get started, animation performance is really important to me. One thing that is kind of surprising to like web developers everywhere, and including myself, is that people expect mobile to be faster than the web. I mean, for us, that doesn't make any sense. We already know, like, okay, you have a giant site, you're trying to do this, and we're like throttle bandwidth and yada yada. But like people are actually just like, this is a tiny little website, it should be faster. So you have to be considering all of those things if you're making SVG animations. Jankfree.org has a ton of great resources for this stuff. It's all Paul Irish and Paul Arrowtwist, I can't remember his last name, Paul Lewis. Yeah, all the good Pauls are there, and Adi Osmani, and they kind of go through all of these timeline things and what it all means and how you can help yourself with performance. It's super great. And to that end, Paul Irish does these like deep performance audits where he runs through the timeline and looks at what everything is. They're really fascinating. He'll grab the Guardian and do it a few times, be like, oh, this is like one thing was stopping up this whole site. I wrote a CSS Tricks article called Weighing SVG Animation Techniques with Benchmarks. So basically, a lot of animation performance libraries were saying like, oh, we perform really well, and CSS was saying, oh, we perform better, and I just didn't know who to believe, so I ran some tests for myself. The caveat here is that I wrote this article in like the beginning of the year, so it's outdated. Like, the web is a moving target. That's a really good thing for us. It means everybody's constantly working on it. It's constantly being updated. Even the way that Chrome is reporting CSS is different now than it used to be. So I would just say you should be testing things for yourself above all else. I have a different kind of setup at my work for what I'm doing than what you have for what you're doing. So writing the same animation a couple of times in a couple of different ways is really helpful. You can see how it affects your workflow, affects the performance, and all of those things. So I'm going to talk a bit about SVG Sprites, and I'm not going to talk about SVG Sprites in the way that Sarah was. Sarah was talking more about icon systems. I'm talking more about like the old, like, you know, PNG, like we're just looking at that one piece. And then I'm also going to talk about cell animation, which is kind of strange to talk about together. But there's this great technique from Joe Harrison where he shows one of these houses depending on the viewport. So every time you have a different size viewport, it gets like more detailed or less detailed depending on what you're seeing. So I took that and was thinking about kind of more of a complex illustration and a standalone illustration. So I was thinking about the Book of Kells and how they have those beautiful like initial drawings for the beginning. So I wanted to do a modern day Book of Kells. So the way that I started designing this was I take the first one, and that's my first A initial, and it has all of this stuff in it. And then when I wanted to do the tablet one, and the tablet one has a slightly different look and feel. It's a different background color. We've got like some of the windows are gone in the buildings, a couple of other things. And then when we collapse to mobile, it gets really, really simple. So I take all of the repeated elements and I dry it out. Even in Illustrator, you can dry things out and like put all of that spriting information in the top, and then I have the collapsed to mobile version. But you'll also notice I made them the same size. That's because we're going to scale the entire SVG and just move the view box. And I'll explain that in a minute. So what we get is this kind of like initial illustration, and then when it gets further down on mobile, it just changes the way that it's outputted. That whole animation and SVG was 8 kilobytes gzipped. I'm going to say it again because it bears repeating. It was 8 kilobytes gzipped. This means that like if you compare that to just an image you're using to like show off your text, just like you put a photo next to your text to illustrate an article, this is like a huge boon for you. You can make something that's way more engaging, and just because you're designing for performance does not mean that it has to look bad. These are not mutually exclusive. Like you can make beautiful designs with shapes and colors and those kind of things in SVG and actually have it be really performant and also responsive. So if I look inside the CSS animation, Illustrator always outputs these like *_1_ ***2 **. So I changed them all to classes, but I still don't want to like go through and rip all of those off and stuff like that. So I just kind of grab all of the classes that are stars, all of the classes that are dots. I don't have to say anything for the 0% or 100% keyframe because I'm just using the default, which is opacity 1. So all I have to define is the opacity 0 for the intermediate point. And I use the same animation keyframes on both. The only thing that's different is the duration, and I have a negative delay on my second one. Now, why would I have a negative delay? It's because I want the animation to be running when you first get there, because it's just kind of this constant infinite loop, right? I don't want one to start and then the other one to start later, so I put a negative delay on it. So no width and height defined for the SVG itself, instead define it in CSS. Actually, Sarah said that you should probably define the width and height, so I am tempted to believe her on that one. I usually do it this way and don't have problems, but I will have a problem, and she's right, if like my CSS doesn't load for some reason and all of a sudden I have a giant SVG. So ignore that part. And I'm using percentage here for the layout, but this is just like any other layout thing. I could be using flexbox. I could be using anything that kind of allows me to change the layout around. It's really important to define the view box here. If you don't know what the view box is, it's kind of the window that we're looking at our SVG. And so if we have a big SVG, I'm actually defining that little window where we're looking at the SVG to be that first part, just that top part. And I have in here preserve aspect ratio XY, X mid, Y mid, meet, which is the default. I'm only bringing it up. I don't have to have that in, but I'm only bringing it up because it is a really powerful unit, and it's out of the scope of this talk to talk about, but you should look it up so that you know what you're working with that. So I'm defining that smaller view box in the code. And then I have media queries. So when I have the mountain skewing, I actually am just using the same thing to target all of the mountains for the top and the bottom. I just call both of them mountain. But when I get to the smaller screens, if I skew 2 degrees, it actually goes out of the box. So I'm just adjusting that animation ever so slightly with good media queries. And this is the fun part because you already know this. You work with media queries all the time. This is not new material. If you just put these two things together, you actually can already make all of this stuff. So now I just have a view box shift with JavaScript. As soon as I get to that smaller screen, I'm going to change the view box from that top one to the bottom one, and then switch it back again. It's very simple. So fallbacks. So I have a few options for fallbacks here. We can fall back with Modernizer, so I'm just putting a class on the body, and then I'm targeting that and having a fallback for that version with a PNG. So I'm fall back to a PNG equivalent. You can also fall back with the picture element and polyfill. Sarah Soidon has a great article about that. But I would say it's a lot of work to do all of the picture element stuff and cut all those images. You should really be checking your analytics, because if you don't have that many people on IE8, maybe you don't need to be doing that. So like really be looking at who is looking at your site and what you need to be adjusting for. Drawing for animation for sprites. So I'm going to talk a little bit about drawing. I don't really usually use drawing in my my coding examples at all. This is the one time I'm going to be talking about drawing. But I'm just going to show you some ways that I work with it that'll cut down some work for you in case you want to do it. So I drew, these are 3 of 21 frames that I drew of a splash animation. So again, it's like that long sprite. This is the closest technique to old cell animation. Cell animation is that they're like Disney animation where they show one thing, take a picture, show another thing, take a picture. And I bring up shooting on 2s because animations in the olden days were 24 frames per second. And they used to shoot on 2s, meaning 2 frames per second. So they really had 12 frames per second because they found that that was as low as they could go before it starts to visually fall apart. Now, usually we want to like just go as fast as we can, as many frames per second as we can. But when you have to draw physically every single one, you don't actually want to draw like 60 frames per second. That's a little bit of overkill. So we're going to go as low as we can here. So we have this pen, which is just a splash in this environment. So we basically take a large sprite and animate the background position, right? We're going to like the negative 3,000 whatever pixels, and we're keeping it super simple. I'm just rolling through the I'm going through the background there with a step. So I define the steps by as many drawings that I have. And then I also have a PNG fallback. I just export it as a PNG, and I have a fallback very easily. So there's 2 ways to make this. One of them is Illustrator with a template. So if you have a really long rectangle and you draw the really long rectangle and you say object, path, split into grid, you can just define right away 24 of them. And it just pops it into a grid. And then I take view, guides, make guides, and all of a sudden I have a guide for this huge thing. I don't have to set up rulers or anything. It just makes it all for me. Then what I'm going to do is I'm going to draw the first one in the first box, draw a rectangle around that. That's the size of the first box guide. And then I'm going to copy both of them and paste it into the other one. So that rectangle keeps me steady inside that guide box. And then I'm not even redrawing it. I'm just pulling the little anchor points apart until it looks a little bit different. So I'm not redrawing it every time. I'm just adjusting it slightly. And that can easily export to a PNG fallback, so that's really cool. And it works with Sketch too. I didn't go through all of these things with Sketch. Another way to do this is in an SVG editor with Grunticon. So you can draw in an SVG editor or on a piece of paper and save off one by one, or you can draw on paper and scan. And then you can use Grunticon, and it makes the fallback for you, which is really nice, so you don't have to go through the whole templating process. Now, if we're going to extend that technique like one further, if I took the steps out of that last animation, what I would see is that it just starts rolling through. So I'm going to use that to my advantage in the next one, where I have a walking sprite, right? It's the same thing with the step animation for the walking, but in the background I have this like, you call it parallax effects, but I have like the background rolling at different speeds, and they're just going through that whole sprite sheet. So it's, again, the same thing where I just draw the guy. But like if you look at another version of this or another view of this would be like that I've z-indexed these things on top of each other. I didn't actually literally z-index them. I just placed them correctly in the DOM. But just so that you know what I mean, I'm placing them on one on top of another. And then I extend the whole thing to keep it dry. All of them have the same amounts. They're all the same width and height. So you can use mix-ins, whatever you feel comfortable with here. And then again, I'm just defining one keyframe value, and it's the background position goes to 200%, and then all of them have the same negative delay, so it's running when you first get there. But the difference is that the background that's further back is moving slower, so it has a longer duration than the next one has a second longer duration. Same thing moving up. So if we look at standalone as illustration. This is kind of what I call the poor man version. It's really simple to take a standalone SVG and make it responsive. You don't even have to do anything. You can just have it be next to your image. And I think this was like a kilobyte or something like that. But I did say complex, didn't I? So I'm gonna go one step further and show you some like real. Now we kind of get into the nitty-gritty of like the really complex stuff. So we're actually going to use JavaScript for this, and it's a library that Sarah brought up again called GreenSock or GSAP. And I don't work for them. They don't pay me. This isn't a marketing thing. I just like am a developer who found a tool that I really, really like, and I'm going to explain why. It solves all sorts of cross-browser inconsistencies. This is, Firefox is coming out with a fix for this, but this is one of a myriad of problems that it solves. There's all sorts of weird bugs, and I just find that all of my code is much more consistent going through all of these things. The biggest thing for me working with GreenSock is the timeline. It allows you to stack tweens. You can set them a little bit before and after each other. You can change their placement in time, and I'll show you a demo of what I mean by that in a second. You can group them into scenes together. You can add relative labels. Relative labels are really important. Like, let's say you get into like 30 seconds into a really complicated animation and you want 17 things to fire at once. If you add a relative label, no matter what changes beforehand, they're all going to fire at exactly the same time, which is really difficult to do in CSS when you start chaining things. And you can animate the scenes. You can animate your animations. That's pretty cool. So you can make the whole thing faster, move the placement of the whole scene. You can nest it. These things all become really important as you're making refinements. I've never gotten all the way through an animation where I didn't have to adjust the timing a few times, maybe a million times. So this becomes really important as you're moving forward. And it's all without recalculation. So the issue with longer CSS animations, and I'm not dogging on CSS animations at all. I still use them. I think they're great for things like UI, UX things where you don't have to load an additional resource for just something that's moving across the screen. But anytime you start chaining like multiple things one after another, you get like 3 or 4 deep, you should probably start switching to JavaScript because it's just much easier to handle those. If I have 2 things that are going off at the same time and they're both 3 seconds long, and then one of them, and they both have to have something happen together at 66%, and one of them has to change a duration, then I have to go back and recalculate what the percentage in time is to make them both go off at the same time. This gets exponentially more complicated as you make more and more complex animations. So if I look at this pen, it's just like this quick demo where I have this thing that goes off, but there's a few repeating parts. And then I'm going to show you the current position on the GSAP timeline. So that one part I repeated. And then this part is like the first thing that happened, so it kind of goes there. And you can see it. I don't have to explain all of the things. So now what happens if I want these 2 things to switch places? So I can just like pull them out of the timeline and move them, and they all just kind of group together. And now I can make it all go faster in one line of code. I mean, that one line of one line of code makes the whole thing faster. That's pretty huge. So other cool things for complex animation. I'm not going to get super nitty-gritty into the code for this, but all my code is open source on CodePen if you want to check it out later, and I will get into the nitty-gritty for just one pen. But motion along a path, we actually have the widest support for motion along a path. It was in SMIL, which is never going to be supported in IE, probably, and probably won't move into Edge, maybe not. And we have it coming in CSS, but there's a gap in time between when we can use it in either of those things. And for the time being, GreenSock has the widest support available. It also has things like draggable. You can interact with your animations. That's really cool. You can animate CSS properties if you need something to like transform and have perspective in space. You can do all of those things with GreenSock. You can make an SVG look like it's drawing itself. You've probably seen those pens where like a Nintendo is being drawn and stuff. There's also Morph SVG, which I think it like kind of hits it out of the ballpark. It's probably the only animation library that can take things of different amounts of points and make them very fluidly morph one into another. There are other animation libraries that offer that morphing, but not with all of those inconsistent path points and so beautifully. It also has relative color tweening. I'm going to go into more detail about relative color tweening. Oh, and cycle stagger, which is like you can have a couple things stagger in a few different options, a few different ways. So if I'm looking at relative color tweening, what do I mean by that? I'm basically taking the initial value of the hue, the saturation, or the brightness and tweening from there. And that becomes important because you're not just saying like, make it a little brighter, but you're saying like, take the place where it was and make it a little bit brighter. And if you think about something like making a whole very complex scene nighttime or something like that, how would we do that? Well, one way is we can make an overlay over the whole thing and make it dark. But that's really like not what nighttime looks like. Nighttime doesn't just get dark. The colors actually shift and change a little bit. So there's like one way of working with it. We could have also like gone in and changed the fill for every single SVG thing, but instead we can just do a relative, like a different, slightly different hue, slightly different saturation, slightly different brightness. And of course, like with brightness and saturation, you're gonna reach a point where you can no longer go any further, and these turtles are really tired. And then with hue, we can continually rotate and eventually just get back to that like original green guy. So I was kind of playing with that idea of the relative color tweening. And I didn't want to just make a night scene because like that seems like it's been done before. So I'm using Draggable for some of this interaction. So I'm allowing the scene to get built here, but I can also like pull it and make it kind of build itself. And then I can make the you know, different types of like viewpoints, like you're further away or you're closer. But then I also have these two buttons where like they're relative color tweens, but they're different from each other. So the way that I'm playing with these will actually change the way that it looks depending on which one I played with next to the other one. So that's kind of like a fun thing to try out and play with. Motion along a path for realism. Now, if you watch, this is like my steampunk lightning. If you watch these fireflies in the way that they're moving, fireflies are kind of hard to animate because they kind of like jerk around and pop, and they don't like go, they don't just like fly here and then fly there. They're kind of like swooping motion, and then they kind of disappear and reappear kind of thing. So if I'm working with motion along a path, I can actually like make them, I can control the amount, I can take these points and control the amount of like curviness to each point. I can control whether or not they go from here to here or go like in a smoother line. I can also make them, you might notice that they're turning along with the path that they have. They're like, the head of the firefly is kind of rotating. That's just auto-rotate true. And all of a sudden the firefly is like moving along instead of staying. He could just like move like this, right? But he's not. They're like turning and kind of moving. That's more realistic motion. So there's also percentage-based transforms on SVG. That's really, really cool. This is like a great one. So you're just saying to like 100% of each one of these things, even though they're different values. So we can do stuff like this that's all fully responsive in every direction. So I'm going to let the whole animation play out before I start playing with it. We've got the environments for humans logo, yay. And then, you know, I can just click this to randomly resize it to whatever, and it's all very, very stable. So it doesn't necessarily have to all be fluid. None of our layouts just go woo, woo. So like we're gonna actually like really implement some responsive design now. So if I'm gonna design interactions in responsive animations, I like to think of them like Legos. So I have one interaction for each building block or piece that I'm working with, and I'm designing those building blocks and having them shift and move to different viewports. So if we've got my Huggy Laser Panda Factory, you know, if I click this, he's like turns into a laser, he's really angry. And if I click this one, he's getting painted as he comes on. And if I click this one, he gets really huggy, and like hearts come out at him. So, you know, if I'm looking at my responsive Huggy Laser Panda Factory, you can see how those pieces are shifting as I'm just changing the viewport. And it works on mobile, and everything, all of the interactions still work. But basically, I'm keeping each unit separate to itself so that it's really easy to design. And I basically scope the design the same way I scope my functions. And I'll show you what that code looks like. So I have one big repeating animation that's going on, and that's like the bubbles are coming up off the top, and some things are happening, like gears are shifting. So I have this whole timeline for all of those things, and I repeat all of it together in one function that I call revolve. And then I have a function called paint panda, and it's all the things that have to happen for that paint panda, and I'm pausing it at the get-go, so I can actually zoom in on. You see how I have paused equals true when I instantiate that timeline here. And then here is just like a really simple jQuery, like I restart it. And then it's just ready to go. So I have all of my, I'm not showing you all of the things that happen here, but I have that function where I'm returning a timeline, and it's scoped to that function. Another thing that you want to play with when you're making like realistic, cool animations is atmosphere. So I made this pen to kind of show like the really main character here isn't actually the orbs floating around. It's kind of like the whole atmosphere of the whole thing and showing a kind of like misty scene. So when we're talking about elemental motion, how do we start achieving some of those things? One is that things in the back are further away and have less contrast and are blurrier. Does the error environment affect movement? I'll show you that in a second. Reducing precision allows for understanding. So if I look at that cloud of smoke, I'm like, oh God, how am I going to animate a cloud of smoke? That looks really super complicated. There's no way. But if I start to simplify it down to its very base forms, and then I see inside it, it has some repeated shapes. And they're these like kind of circular things. And I'm like, hey, I could definitely animate those. Like for sure, I can put a casing around that thing and start moving those balls around. And then I kind of think about the way that the air is playing with those balls and kind of acting on it. And those balls can kind of like move in with the air, and I can start to animate those and like, kind of isolate each part of that elemental motion. So if we're going to put techniques together, we've got morph SVG from GSAP, which tweens paths to paths, tweens shapes to paths, makes animation magic, basically. And you just point from one ID to another. It's super simple. And we're going to use fine shape index so we can kind of like finely control the way that it's moving. So you can load this extra plugin, and a GUI will come up. So if we see this animation, this is the auto. But if I you can watch that red circle. Let me see if that's. There we go. If we watch that red circle move around, you can actually pick a different shape index, and it changes the way that tween works. So you have fine control even over the way that it's morphing. So I made this pen, and this is all done with SVG. And I just kind of want to like talk about some of the things that you can do with SVG that you might not realize you can do with SVG. So how did I make this? Well, I just kind of drew the candle in Illustrator, and then I have all of these paths for the light. That's like a bunch of different ones, just like the sprite. I drew a bunch of different of these like kind of light paths, and then I have a kind of singular, smaller one inside. And then I have this gradient in the background that I'm expanding and collapsing all the time. I'm using this GUI technique from Lucas Beber. It's pretty awesome. It's a filter that you can use in SVG. But really what I'm doing is I'm animating the filter. So when you look at a candle, it doesn't stay consistently one mass. So rather than having it just be goo, I'm actually changing the way that it's like sometimes it's straighter and it's like more of a thing, and sometimes it's less of a thing. So I'm animating that filter. And then I'm also going through, it's just a simple for loop here. I've named all of those like light shapes F1, F2, F3, so it can just cycle through all of those. And I've added a relative label, so I'm saying like from the point of begin +1, begin +2, all of those things. And so it can just kind of cycle through all of that stuff. So there's more than one way of working. That's one way that I made that pen, right? But I could have actually done it another way, so let's explore that. There's a guy named Blake Bowen. He's really super awesome, and you should follow him on CodePen and all of that stuff. He does really great stuff. So he was working with this thing called a Catmull-Ron spleen. And there's an article about this. If you're like interested in this subject, there's an article about its history in computer science. But basically what it does is you pass it a bunch of points, and it's kind of like what I was talking about, the motion, where instead of it going from here to here to here, it's like curving. You kind of define that curve. So you pass in these points, and I could have just continually updated and changed those points in the Catmull-Ron spleen. I could have used this and animated this instead of drawing every single shape. So that's like one way of working. And the last thing I'm going to do really quick is design and information and animation. We talked a little bit about infographics. I'm going to show you how to make them accessible and responsive. So if we're revisiting old approaches, we've got responsive animated infographics. There's all these sources with detailed analysis of like how great, like for lead improvements, infographics are. So here's just one example of some of the stuff that was said. It increased traffic to their website by over 400%. Lead increased by 4,500%. The new number of visitors to their site to almost 78%. These are huge amounts of conversions that everyone's trying to get at. So all of these posts are older than 2 years, and we don't see infographics anymore. So what happened? My theory is that it's not responsive. There was a tipping point 2 years ago where people were really going towards mobile more than anything. And have you ever shared an infographic before or looked at a shared infographic before on mobile? It's like this horrible pinch and grab affair, and it's just garbage. You're just not engaging at all. So it's not updated to its current context, but it's also not updated to its current context in design. Like it really has that old salon style of design, and it hasn't been updated to like a flatter aesthetic, which is what we're all kind of doing a lot of these days. So if we have this pen, we have global, it's kind of hard to see on this screen, I guess. We have all these global warming solutions and their effectiveness levels, and it goes through, and the money bags kind of shows where we're at here, and you can also play with this if you need to go back and like read something again here. We can kind of see that. We can replay the whole thing there. But the nice thing about this is it's fully responsive and works on mobile, and it's also accessible. So when I was designing this, I'm basically thinking about them as two different SVGs. The money bags are not attached to that circle. The circle is its own thing. The money bags are their own thing. Two different SVGs doing two different things in a larger view. And we've basically got the same thing that you do with any other. We've got a static view for desktop, and then we switch to a percentage as it goes down to mobile and kind of moves towards that. And we have fallbacks. We have accessibilities. This is kind of a work in progress for accessibility. I'm still learning accessibility, so like I'm probably going to continually be updating the slide as I learn more. But you have title tags, you have description tags. There's also a resource by Leonie Watson here with support charts, and an article by Dudley Story, two people much smarter than me, that you should check out their materials. And the last thing I want to say is that social coding sites really help you learn. Again, I don't work for them, they don't pay me, but I do think that they actually really help you learn things. So if you have a chance to be on CodePen and check out you can check out my pens or any of Gregor's pens, or a bunch of other people here are active on CodePen, and you can kind of dig in and see how all of this stuff works. So that's my CodePen propaganda poster. And there's all sorts of people you should know about. You should check out my slide later and go follow all of these people who are super great. Listen to the SVG Immersion podcast, and go sign up for Web Animation Weekly. I taught a front-end master's course, so if you want to know about the code behind all of these things in more detail, it's like 5 hours of material that you can go look up. I'm also making an O'Reilly book. This is not the actual cover. My friend is trolling me with this one. It's not even how you spell my last name. But yes, I got the rare man blob animal for my cover. I'm writing an O'Reilly book called SVG Animation that'll come out next year, and I think we have a pre-release coming out in the spring. You don't have to text that anymore, but thank you.